Okay. Well, welcome everybody to the first Legislative Studies virtual workshop. So we're here to kick this off with the discussion of Jonathan Lewallen's paper, The More I Get, the More I Want, Committee Adaptation to a Crowded Congressional Agenda. So the format we're going to follow here, and I'll act as the sort of the chair of the workshop for today, and so I'm going to try to keep track of a queue of people who want to speak. So the basic rule is that you put up 2 fingers for what did I say? 2 fingers for a new topic, 1 finger for the next, if you want to add to this point. So I'll just keep a running list. So the way we're going to do this, since we've all read the paper, we're going to give Jonathan a chance to introduce the project and say a few things for context. And then we'll start by moving through the paper and trying to offer suggestions by part. So we'll talk about framing, and then theory, and then research design, and then empirics. And I'll try to sort of move us along either as the conversation sort of gets stale or as time permits, and then we'll have time at the end to sort of open it up. And of course, those are sort of general guidelines, so you shouldn't feel overly restricted by them, but that will just so that we try to give sort of good coverage of the paper and some organization to our comments. Okay, so we have a. Sorry, I'm just looking at James's email to try to get him on the phone and walk him through. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start. So, Jonathan, you want to offer any kind of feedback an introduction to the paper?
Sure. I want to say thanks for having me here. It's a really great opportunity to be able to take part in this, and I really appreciate everyone taking their time to be involved with it. This paper is part of my dissertation, which looks more broadly at sort of how party leaders have gained more control and authority over agenda setting and really centralized a lot of the tasks involved with determining the congressional schedule and what issues come up for debate and things like that, and how that change has really affected committees specifically, but congressional policy making more broadly. And I look forward to any comments, feedback that you all have today.
Thanks. All right. You guys want to open?
I'm happy to if you want.
All right, go for it, Scott.
So, John, I think maybe I'm going to ask you for a little bit more context here. In okay. That, I mean, I kind of understand what you're getting at with respect to committees that seem to be conditioning their behavior in different ways than they did decades ago. So, but the question, I guess, is what exactly are they conditioning their behavior on, right? And it seems like there are several things that you touch on early on in the paper, but there's something deeper here that should be, I think, in some ways dictating how committees are reacting to the overall environment in Congress. So, you know, if I was to ask you for a kind of T-shirt version of this, but also one that doesn't just capture what you're doing empirically in the paper, but really what the overall objective of the paper was. It just seems to me it's probably a somewhat broader story than what you're getting at, but I'll let you respond, I guess.
Okay, yeah. So the T-shirt version, I suppose, is that party leaders are creating more uncertainty and about what will get to the floor, and so committees are devoting fewer of their resources to legislative activity. That's sort of a large T-shirt, I guess, but But that's sort of the biggest finding, or the biggest takeaway, I think, that I have from this project, both in this paper and the other work that I've done. The objective, I guess, as you say, is to sort of get at this sort of fundamental shift that's happened, and this deeper change that we've seen with how committees are deciding how to allocate their time and their resources towards different kind of policymaking activities, and how that change then in turn affects sort of Congress's relationship to other institutions and its place within the policy process more generally. Is that I can give more context? I'm happy to provide more.
I have some comments framing wise, so I'll step in unless Jason wants to cut in line.
I have some as well, but you go first.
Okay. So let me focus mine, and this is going to come up as a recurring theme a bit, I think, in some of the later sections. But I want to point you in particular to, for example, some of the discussion near the second to last page of the intro. There's a sentence that begins, "Committee competition for agenda space drives much of this process," and then at the end of that paragraph, another sentence, similarly, "Committees that must compete for agenda space, and by doing so they drive congressional agenda setting." Mm-hmm. And so this felt to me like it was an overly vague description of the sort of inputs and the outputs of what you were trying to say there. So when I read that, I wanted to know, why are they competing in the first place for agenda space? What's the motivation to compete at all? And that's not to say that I don't think there is one. It's just it's that I think there are several, right? I mean, there's lots of different potential drivers for that kind of behavior. And so I wanted to know, even in the intro, just a little more about why. And then I guess I wondered what sort of the competition looked like early in this, even in the intro, sort of in your setup and in your theory. What's the, what are the rules of the competition? Who's arbitrating? Why are there, what's the reversion, right? And so what happens in the absence of some other decision rule? So I guess I thought there wasn't enough. There was a lot said without pinning down what we mean exactly when we talk about committee competition.
Okay. Yeah, and to just respond to that quickly,
Jonathan, I'm going to pause you for just a second. We have James Curry that got on, so I'll welcome you. So James, sorry for the technical difficulties.
Oh, no problem.
We just got going here. As I was saying, we're going to sort of go through the paper and roughly in sections. We'll offer some comments on framing, and then theory and research design and empirics, and then we'll have time at the end, I think, for sort of general comments. And of course, that shouldn't constrain you at all, in the sense that you can bleed over a little if points make sense together, but just as a sort of general guiding mechanism. So anyway, Scott and I both offered some comments on framing, and Jonathan was about to respond, and then I think Jason is next up. So if you want to get in line, let me know with either a 1 or a 2, depending on whether the comments are following on the current point or are a new point.
Can do.
And I was about to respond, but I'm happy to defer to respond either at the end or even just at the end of everyone's comments about the framing. So we can move over that.
Okay, Jason.
Yeah, first, let me apologize for looking and sounding like hell. I'm quite under the weather today. So, but in general, I buy your story. I think it makes a lot of sense to me that committees are behaving in a different way because they have become less central, I think, to the policy-making process. But I think the frame could use some work. The frame doesn't really set that up as well as I think it could. You're open with the Farm Bill and the Transportation Bill. To me, those are not cases of where there wasn't room on the floor for those bills. They were bills that Republicans couldn't get enough votes for. I mean, I didn't see that as a scarcity issue. It wasn't as like, oh, we'd love to get to the Farm Bill if we could only have time. It was, we'd love to pass the Farm Bill. We could get 218 votes without having to moderate our bill to the to something the Democrats want. So I think I sort of see the frame of your paper as more of a decline of committee governance and a rise of party as party governance, and then what are the consequences of that for how committees choose to behave in response. You know, you could frame this around even you could mention the decline of rules committees and independent power base. You know, we were talking about this 25 years ago. It would all be about what the rules committee is deciding should get to the floor, when, how, and whatnot. But now it's so much more centralized in the party leadership, and so I think it might be a better frame to start out and say, well, you know, this is happening. What are the consequences of this? And the consequences are committees are doing other things. So I'll stop there for now.
Okay. James, did you have something?
Yeah, I generally agree with Jason's point there about how the two authorization bills that Jonathan uses to open the paper I don't think fit very well. I do think the example he uses about cybersecurity and page 13 potentially may be a better fit, because that's one where you see them, like as far as framing where he's going with this, because that's one where you see them try for a couple of Congresses to produce a bill that can get to the floor, and it doesn't work, so they back off and take an oversight approach and no longer try to legislate. So if you want to have an example, like just to lead off the paper, I think that one fits a lot nicer than the Farm Bill and the Surface Transportation Bill.
Scott?
Yeah, so I wanted to follow on with a comment that Jason made a second ago, which is the question about scarcity, right? And a lot of the paper is framed around scarcity. And I'm curious what everyone else thinks. While we're all observing that committees are seemingly less involved in the core lawmaking activities of Congress than they used to be, it's probably not a scarcity story, right? That there's plenty of time if the lawmakers actually want to put the time into dealing with legislation on the floor that comes out of committees. They just choose not to, for some of the reasons that John points out in the beginning of the paper, that the majority's fearful of contentious or complicated or difficult floor votes for their party members, or they don't want to give a win to the administration, or for any of a number of reasons. So it's probably not a scarcity story. And this was, I think, in some ways getting back to my first question to John when I was asking him for a little more framing for what he's trying to achieve. So it's, and I think John said that, you know, uncertainty was part of this story. I think uncertainty is probably a benevolent way to say it, right? I mean, I think there's a, excuse me, for the committees, and particularly the committee chairs, it's more so they know that the leadership's not going to bring certain bills forward, and so they figure, why waste our time when certain bills are just never going to make it to the floor. There's no consideration. So they don't want to waste their time. So I guess I'm asking that as a question: is it really a scarcity story, or is it that committees are really reacting to the reality of what they're expecting to occur over the coming months, or even the remainder of that congressional term, and they're just simply throwing up their hands and saying, well, you know, writing bills, you know, working on clean water or working on the FAA reauthorization is just going to not be fruitful time. So, you know, and this is where I was sort of saying, and I think this is what Jason was getting at a moment ago. Sorry to go on here.
Go for it.
That, you know, perhaps the motivation for the empirical tests later on would be to show a little bit of data, right? So Barbara Sinclair has this, it's either a table or a figure, I can't remember, in Unorthodox Lawmaking, which shows in the last 4 or 5 congressional terms how committees are less involved in the making of major legislation. So it shows like the percentage of major legislation that went around the normal committee process. You know, and the other things you could show is, you know, are committees simply producing fewer bills, right? Just by committee, you know, what's been their bill activity over the last, you know, 30 years to see if they're actually doing fewer bills. Are they really conditioning their behavior? You know, just simple descriptive before you get into the why.
You have something, Jonathan?
Yeah, I guess if I mean, thanks all for your comments. I mean, you all are getting at sort of the difficulties I've had in how to think of this and how to talk about this, which is, on the one hand, sure, I mean, committees do know a lot of what will and won't make it to the floor, particularly today compared to 30, 40 years ago, and a lot of that does have to do with the partisanship and the ideological environment that they're in, and so how much of this story is that, and how much of it is just trying to plan and not for whatever happens. And yeah, and I just in my own thinking about this myself, I sometimes have a hard time knowing how much to play up this sort of uncertainty and scarcity piece of it. I agree that uncertainty probably isn't the right word in most of the cases, but I think it also does come up sometimes, and enough for committees that it is something that they have to deal with, or that it characterizes at least some of what committees are facing. I mean, I can think of I think it was the Water Resources bill a couple of years ago that the Senate was in the middle of debating on the floor, and then they just had to pull it because something else came up that was more pressing that they had to deal with. And I think it was Shaheen who was managing it on the floor. She just had to sort of drop it, and I don't know if it's come. I think it came up again shortly thereafter. But how do those committees sort of anticipate things like that? And yeah, I mean, this is a broader story as I alluded to, and I think as you all are pointing out, and I know I need to do a better job of telling that broader story, and hopefully each successive time that I've worked on this paper, I get a little closer to that, and I think your comments are all really helpful in sort of pointing me more in that direction.
Jason, you're up.
Yeah, so just one thing there, I would maybe separate those two concepts, scarcity and uncertainty. Those are not synonyms. We can imagine a world where floor time is exceedingly scarce, so there's very minimal uncertainty. You just know it's not going to hit the floor. If you're going to keep that frame, though, I think you need to do a better job in the front end of establishing that scarcity exists, and more importantly, I think for your story, is that it has become that floor time has become more scarce over time. You assert that, but you don't really demonstrate that. And so, if you want to stick with that, I'd like to see some sort of data on that, other than just an assert.
James?
Yeah, and just to add to that, you have those first 4 figures, which should demonstrate that the committees are producing fewer bills, but that alone doesn't demonstrate that it's because floor time is scarce. So I agree with Jason that you have to find something else that really shows that there's just less time for these bills, and not just that committees potentially are producing maybe just as much policy, but maybe in fewer number of bills, just larger bills, or those measures can mean a number of things that are different from there's less space on the floor, there's less time.
let me offer one more comment, and then maybe it sounds like I think we're probably ready to start talking more directly about theory. But let me offer a comment that maybe bridges the two, which is, so the opening line of the second section just defines what we mean by agenda setting. It's the classic Jones and Baumgartner. Agenda setting can refer to many activities and processes, but at its core, the term refers to the process by which an organization comes to pay attention to some issues rather than the others. And this is, I think, actually that manifestation of the definition is even a little closer, or a little less, sort of dual personality than I think sometimes agenda setting is, right? Where in one side of the literature, what we mean is that there's a very, we're asking questions about procedure and about the very literal way in which, legislature things make it to the final stages, whatever we think are the important stages, and in what form, and who has the power to sort of dictate those things. And then, of course, on the other side, and what I think of more typically as the Baumgartner and Jones and other sort of more policy-focused literature on agenda setting is how do we get people to pay attention to it, whatever we think is important, whatever we think that means, right? So it might be as simple as getting lots of media attention, and it might be, but it might part of that strategy is going to be to get votes and on it, or to have debate on the floor, or in or hearings in committee. And I guess so one of the things I like is that there's a sense in which this paper is moving in the direction of marrying these a little bit, right? But it doesn't develop that, I think, enough in the frame, in the sense that, and then later, I think, in the theory, in that there's kind of this choice as it's presented to the committee between kind of settling for having hearings or doing oversight, and then, or instead trying to move things up through the legislative process. And it from a kind of pure attention-based agenda setting, it may be that getting hearings and having oversight is just as valuable as moving it through the process, depending on whose incentives we're talking about. But if we're talking about the sort of outcome policy change-based agenda setting that a lot of literature is focused on, having oversight hearings is not nearly as good as change policy. And so I guess in the frame, I'd like to see that acknowledged and taken on a little more directly. So what do we mean? What exactly does this paper mean when they mean by agenda setting, and how is it situated relative to what I see as mostly two distinct literatures on different kinds of agenda setting or different definitions? Okay, so why don't we move to the theory part of the paper, and I'll open it up for those sorts of comments. So if anybody wants to jump in line first, go for it. James?
Sure. So essentially in the theory part, you advance, obviously you so you're going to do this in the introduction as well, but you advance essentially two arguments. One about how committees work to anticipate the amount of floor space they're going to have and so adapt their behavior accordingly, and then two, that the leadership, these trends towards sort of leadership, centralized leadership chambers, has reduced the overall agenda space and made it even worse. I think you make the first argument better than the second, that committees need to adapt, that they have to anticipate how much floor space they're going to have and they adapt their behavior a bit more. I think the second argument you do less well in fleshing out. But I don't think you necessarily, and if you're thinking about how to make your argument, how to do this paper best, I don't think you necessarily need both of these in one paper, in the same paper. I think you can, and I think it would maybe do service to each argument to have them be able to focus more on attention on each one a little bit more separately. Because I think you have a pretty strong case that committees have to adapt, but not as strong of a case, and not as strong of a reason that leaders are causing a problem of floor space. So, I mean, for example, with the leadership part side of things, your first set of points seems to point more towards how there's essentially point more towards the fact that there's more party conflict in the chambers, and that this has made it more difficult for there to be room on the floor or opportunities on the floor for certain bills. And the second part of your argument about the party leadership essentially, I think, underestimates the degree to which leaders have the capacity to work on policy and work on legislation. And you point out, like, the CRS statistic that as leadership staff has grown over the last 30, 40 years, a lot of it has been towards political and communications staff. But if you dig into these numbers a little bit more, you'll find that only about 30% of the increase is communications, and the rest of the increase is caused by political and policy staff. And I don't think there's necessarily as much of a distinction between political staff and policy staff as you might think. Generally, people who are working on leadership staff are working on policy and politics. But at the same time, I think you would find that often when leaders are trying to coordinate things in the chamber, they draw on committees, chairs, and committee chairs' staffs in particular to try to fill in the policy details when you're doing negotiations. So I think, in a way, the way you line it up, you kind of underestimate the degree to which leaders could do quite a bit in sort of centralized, like organizing the chamber and organizing the scheduling and processing a lot of bills. An example, you can look at the so-called omnibus right now, the CR omnibus. But clearly, the leadership is driving the negotiations on it, but you also see that the appropriations chairs and the appropriations staff are heavily involved in actually doing the policy work. I think they can draw on those staffs as well. So I think, in a way, when you're making this argument about the leadership, you're really underestimating the degree to which leadership does not have the capacity to organize the chamber and allow for a lot of legislation to come on the floor and allow legislation to go through the agenda. And essentially, when I read through it, I'm not as convinced about that part of the argument at this point. I think it needs a lot more to be fleshed out a lot more, and a lot of these assumptions need a lot more attention.
Okay. Scott, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, sure. So I think that in some ways, well, I agree a lot with James's points. I'm wondering if it was sort of an easier question, right? Which is, and in some ways, James, maybe you can tell me if I'm going, I'm diverging a little bit too much from reality. But you know, if committees are really faced with this dilemma that they're just going to simply get less floor time than everyone else, or than they do. Sorry. They basically have sort of three choices, right? One, or as committee chairs, one is that they could keep legislating, just keep plowing forward, producing legislation, and hope that the leadership brings their bills to the floor. A second is they could simply shut down, right? They could just do far less. They could demobilize, so to speak. Or the third, and I think this is what John is suggesting in the paper, is that they shift between, they shift their activities away from legislating and more toward oversight, right? So on committees where the expectation is that they're simply going to have less ability to bring their legislation to the floor, I think what John is suggesting here is that they will shift more of their activities toward oversight, which are things that are less dependent upon the leadership to sanction, right? They can just simply go ahead. They can be Darrell Issey, right? Which is they can hold lots and lots of oversight hearings, but there's no legislation or very little legislation going to come out of it. It's mostly just simply to go after the administration or make a political point or conduct investigations, but not with a legislative intent. So, you know, I'm wondering if, John, if that's where you wanted to go with this, and simply, if it might be possible just to simplify it and say, if lawmakers are facing this diminished ability to bring legislation to the floor, are they going to choose one of these options, which is simply plow ahead with legislation, shut down or demobilize, do less, or shift your activities over to oversight?
Yeah, and that is essentially the argument I'm putting forth. The fact that it didn't come out that simple is something that I need to work on, because I think you stated it really well, and the impression I'm getting is that I have a lot of extraneous stuff in here that is sort of detracting from that nice clean argument, and so yeah, I think you're absolutely right, or at least your reading of my paper is a good one, and that is sort of at the heart, the relationship that I'm trying to get at is shutting down and just sort of not doing anything is an option for committees, and we have seen, a decrease in just the overall number of hearings over the years. But I am sort of making this assumption that committees are going to go ahead and make policy in some way, and so how do they do that? Do they do that through legislation and just sort of pushing ahead with whatever bills that they have, or do they then try to anticipate the fact that, well, there's a pretty strong likelihood that this might not make it to the floor, and so we'll just bring in bureaucrats or interest groups or whomever, and we'll talk to them about making policy that way. And we might not get all of what we want that we would have through a bill, but we'll at least get something rather than spending all our time on a bill and getting nothing. And again, my explanation of that was not nearly as elegant as yours, Scott. So I do need to do a better job of simplifying sort of the basic sort of anticipatory process that the committees are going through.
Okay, Jim, and then Jason.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think the way that you can really work to simplify it is in some degree you're trying to not only explain that, but then at the same time explain like why is floor space shrunk. It seems like trying to do both is just too much, and it's just like demonstrate that fewer bills are coming to the floor, demonstrate that floor space has shrunk, set it up like that, and then okay, here's how committees have adapted. When committees don't think their bills are going to come to the floor, they focus on oversight. And I think you're absolutely right that that's what they do. You see committees like the Science Committee last Congress, which produced like 2 bills. But they held hearings every week because they had the sense, or they knew, or they were told that their legislation wasn't, they weren't a priority this Congress, that science legislation wasn't going to be a priority, that they weren't going to get bills on the floor, or at least anything beyond sort of suspension calendar bills.
Jason?
Yeah, I agree with what James is saying there. And so that's a case where their uncertainty was very low, but their scarcity was high. But I just reiterate what Jim said. He said it better than I could say it, so I'll leave it at that.
Let me add real quick sort of a point that I think has been touched on, but I want to hammer home, which is I think throughout the theory section, for me, the biggest stumbling block was what seemed to be kind of a unitary actor assumption, but I wasn't even sure what the incentives of the unitary actor were. And it's the committee that wants all these things, right? But who's the committee? And from start to finish, sort of like I kept wondering, and I would have been okay with lots of simplifying assumptions. Although I think lots of your action is, and the interesting part is really not a simplifying assumption. It's, I think that really is what drives things, but at very least you need some explanation of what it is that the committee wants and who it is, if not a fuller explanation of what the internal process looks like to define sort of the direction of the committee or the stake of the committee in trying to compete for this agenda space. And I mean, there's lots of, this is one of the things I like so much about Scott and John's book is it gives us a reason why committees sort of, individuals within committees have incentives together to try to do things in competition in some sense with other committees and other members. And I think you need something like that here in order to make this story, I think, compelling theoretically.
Do you mind if I?
No, go.
I think the fact that this is a part of a dissertation allows John to do all the things that Nate and Jim you just mentioned. So he could probably have a separate chapter that is the motivator, right? That sort of lays out the dynamic that's been occurring in Congress over the last couple decades and why that should then condition or suggest that we would see certain kinds of behavior by committees. So I think he'll have, John, you should have plenty of room to do this. And also on Jason's point, right? The obvious actor that we would think of here is the committee chair, sort of acting on behalf of the committees. And I think to some degree they probably are guiding what's going on in committees, though it would not be a bad thing, as Jason Nate suggested a minute ago. You know what? I was calling you Jason, Nate. Sorry about that.
We look a lot alike.
It's the lack of hair, the glare, and then I can't figure out who's who. That Nate was suggesting a minute ago that you give some more detail to internally what's going on in committees. That would be great, especially if the dynamic internal to committees has been changing. Ross Baker, we probably all received this free little monograph that Ross Baker sent around a couple months ago on bipartisanship in the Senate, and it was really about bipartisanship in committees. But it's one of these things where it's a nice little look into the internal workings of Senate committees in particular. But you could do the same for House committees. It would be interesting to note whether or not the dynamic internal to committee operations has really changed in any way. But load some of the responsibility for what committees are doing on chairs, and I think in some ways that would help your empirical stuff, because my sense is, though you do have committee chairs in there a little bit with in some of your tests, but I think you haven't quite captured the importance of committee chairs in determining what committees are going to do, and it's I think that to a large degree, committee chairs are really important in this process.
Okay. Jim?
I think so. Theoretically, I think anything that potentially needs to consider more closely, and you mentioned this in the theoretical section, but it's just how much what a bill does or how it addresses an issue affects whether or not it receives floor time. And Jason was talking about this when I first logged in. But that's a big part of which bills get to the floor, which don't, essentially what's in them, how they're trying to address the policy. Is it something that can get 218 votes, et cetera, et cetera. And you mentioned this, but it seems like one of the big barriers to convincing people that it's really about floor space or about agenda space is convincing people that this committee's bills weren't ignored or weren't not brought up, or the committee didn't act because it's because of floor time or agenda space, and not because the bills that they wanted to produce were not passable. And I'm not sure exactly what you do to get at that more, but I think it's something that theoretically needs more attention, and then obviously it's something that has to be addressed as well when we get that situation.
Jason, did I miss anything?
No.
Okay. Jonathan, you want a response?
Yeah, I have a response, but if anyone else has other comments, I can. But I'll go ahead. I guess. So on the unitary actor assumption, I mean that's again something that I've thought a lot about, and I'm comfortable with it to the extent that others have made that assumption, but y'all are absolutely right that there's a lot that's going on within these committees that I'm not really accounting for in any specific way. I mean, I'll note that I've done a little bit of other work looking at centralization in committees and the extent to which subcommittees are doing anything anymore. The short answer is they're not doing anything anymore. Right, the unitary option, and particularly, as Scott noted, sort of putting a lot of this on the committee chairs, I think does hold to the extent that a lot of these subcommittees just aren't carrying a lot of the weight anymore. The House subcommittees, I think, are still holding about, or at least involved in 60 to 70% of hearings, but that's down from almost 100% 20 years ago. So even that, you could argue, is still a pretty big shift. And then in the Senate, to the extent that subcommittees ever did anything, it wasn't much, but nothing. I could do a lot more. I agree to sort of tease out that assumption and why I'm making it, and as several pointed out, sort of what that means for my assumptions about what committees want and that in turn will affect how they react to these incentives and shifts in these incentives and shifts in floor space availability. Jim made the point, if it's not, I apologize, but I made the point about looking at different committees and whether certain committees are getting more bills to the floor and whether or others. I get at that a little bit with some of the graphs that I have now, and in particular about which committees are reporting out bills. It's not quite a measure of what's on the floor, but you can see at least a committee like the government oversight committees in both chambers, back in the 1980s, were reporting out maybe 60 bills in the Congress, and now it's up at 100, while just about everyone else has declined, which is a really big shift. And the fact that, again, I'm sort of relying on this assumption that, or maybe not even an assumption, but I'm relying on the fact that committee jurisdictions are sort of roughly organized by issue, then shifts in which committees are getting more or less floor space, which committees are reporting out more or fewer bills, then sort of translates into changes in the chamber's overall issue agenda. Now, if you have something like government affairs, which has a really broad jurisdiction and can report out just about anything, that falls a little flat, and I acknowledge that, and that is something I need to work on. One idea that came to me just now was looking at the number of bills that were left pending on the legislative calendar at the end of a given Congress, which I have as a dependent or as an independent variable in my empirical analysis, but several of you have sort of made this point or suggestion that I provide more data on sort of the shrinking floor space. And while that doesn't quite measure the shrinking floor space, the fact is that number has gone way up. And in the Senate, off the top of my head, in the late 70s, early 80s, there were maybe 150, 160 bills that were left pending on the calendar at the end of a Congress, and now it's in the 300, 400, 500, 600s, which speaks to, if not a decline in the number of bills that are making it to the floor, at least potentially a decline in the floor or the party leader's ability to satisfy demand for space on the legislative calendar. So what could be interesting then is to compare by committees and look at and to compare how many bills they're reporting out and how many bills under their jurisdiction are actually getting taken up and voted on. And that I think that would be a really good addition to this paper, and possibly help satisfy some of the what's missing, what I've sort of stated and asserted but haven't really shown empirically in this paper.
Scott, you had some?
Well, in some ways it's an it's a movement in the empirical direction, but
Go ahead. Well, we can flip back and forth a little bit.
Sure. So as you were mentioning that there are more bills left left untreated on the floor, right? Which suggests all kinds of possible scenarios that are going on. One is, as I was sort of alluding to earlier about committees having this choice about what to do, what that could suggest is that committees are simply plowing ahead with lawmaking, and whatever happens after they're reported is whatever happens. That's possible. It's also possible that some of this legislation that's left that's left unconsidered is less important, and there's just a lot of that going on. And I don't necessarily only mean like commemorative legislation, but legislation that perhaps was never going to be taken seriously to begin with. I don't know what's going on with this. But it also brought up another matter for me as I was looking at the empirics, which was sort of your use of raw counts on your data rather than things like proportions. If you look at the figures on referral hearings or the figures on bills reported, the differences between committees can be stark in terms of ends, right? So, for example, looking at Figure 3, the difference between the bills reported by the Armed Services Committee and the bills reported by, say, Natural Resources, the scale is just monumentally different, right? And so I'm wondering if the N is really the right number here to be looking at, and maybe we should be looking at proportional differences, because there's just a huge difference in those numbers. I don't know if that caught anyone else's eye.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let me jump in for I'm going to jump in for a second, and I'm going to transition. I'm going to sort of follow a little on Scott's point to go backwards, a more general empirical point, which is the hypotheses, and this is a little bit of a sort of hobby horse for me, so I apologize. But I think it's easy to, when we jump into the hypothesis section, to start anticipating the analysis and the measures that we're going to use to execute our research design. But really, right, the hypotheses are extensions of our theory and our theoretical concepts, right? And there's a sense in which, you could imagine in some ways dozens of measures to measure the basic concept of, for example, in your floor feedback hypothesis, you say, it reads, committees with more bills under their jurisdiction reaching the floor in a previous Congress will conduct more legislative activity in a given Congress. But there might be, we could think of, probably a dozen different operationalizations of what the concept is, which is simply the perception of restricted floor space, or the perception of available floor space for that particular committee, right? And, part of Scott's point is the other side of this, which is we can also think of a lot of different measures of legislative activity, or of, in fact, in some ways, it's not even legislative activities, but it's the more general concept of pursuit of agenda space, right? So your hypotheses, I think, go too far in the direction of measurement instead of remaining sufficiently conceptual so that you allow yourself to say, one way we would operationalize this is this, and maybe it doesn't. So you might, in fact, test the same hypothesis with several different measures. But also you allow others to take your theoretical setup and come up with clever research designs that they can execute and cite your, it makes I think it boxes in and compartmentalizes the potential impact of what you're doing rush ahead to the measure, the one specific measure you're going to use, and state that in the hypothesis. So I guess I'd encourage you to try to hold off a little bit in terms of the way that you present that stuff, and remain conceptual for longer in the paper. Jim, I think you've been waiting.
Yeah, I was trying to think of if you're trying to. Jonathan was talking about ways, and Scott was talking about ways to try to actually demonstrate floor space. I was trying to think about other ways that you could potentially show that floor space is shrunk, and potentially it's looking at, if you want a measure that's not related in any way to what's actually happening in Congress at the moment, like as far as like things that might cause the floor space to change or fluctuate during the Congress. Potentially you look at how much floor time did the leadership schedule at the start of a session, because that's different from year to year. Or if that's not sufficient, you could look at week to week the majority leader puts out a schedule, and they indicate how much time they're going to use for actual consideration of bills versus how much time is going to be used for special order speeches. Has that amount of time that's allocated for the consideration of bills shrunk across time? Because I think those are better measures of if you're trying to establish that, look, there's less floor space, and so committees have had to adapt their behavior. I think you need something like that rather than anything that the committees are actually doing, since that's what you're saying is the consequence.
Jason?
Oh, I'm good right
now. So I think we've sort of moved on beyond theory now, so I'll officially open up the floor for research design and empirics comments, although I know we've already sort of gotten there. So, Jonathan, do you have any comments before, any other interjections before I think Scott has something, yeah?
Just briefly, I mean, I have looked at the data in proportions, and the differences between committees you still see in proportions with counts. I understand your argument, and I'm sympathetic to it. I'll probably go back to using that rather than the raw counts, because, as you say, right, the scales are just way off when you're comparing certain committees to each other. And then on the point about the hypotheses, I mean, I really like the idea of drawing them back more towards the theoretical side rather than, as you put it, trying to anticipate the measures that I'm using. And that's something I'll really work on, because you're right. I mean, I don't know how else to put it, but yeah, I like that idea a lot.
Scott?
So speaking of the Cromnibus, as Jim brought it up a minute ago, and it got me thinking when I was reading the paper, and this is the ugly way of, this is how our job as congressional scholars has gotten particularly ugly, which is that there may be a bunch of things going on with respect to lawmaking, but they're unfortunately now being packed into omnibus legislation, continuing resolutions, and this kind of lumping of lots of different legislation into big packages passed at the end of some deadline. And so I hate to ask this question, but what if committees are doing stuff, they're reporting bills out, and what's actually occurring is that the content of those is being mashed up into some big omnibus legislation, or there's even, and I guess this is an empirical question. I've not really seen any research on it. Maybe somebody did do it. They're doing more legislating in appropriations legislation than they used to, right? And so what was used to be that lawmakers used to accomplish through regular authorizations are now being done in a different way, and the big objectives of committees are just getting thrown into some big omnibus.
Jim?
Yeah, I mean, I really want to echo that point from Scott, because I think that's, to some degree, what is happening. Committees and members are introducing bills sort of with the hope that now they've claimed turf, that this language is theirs, and so that when an omnibus is being put together, or a major authorization, to the degree those actually happen anymore, or like some other big bills being put together, that like they've created the space, that this is ours, this is my language, and they try to get it included in this bill, and they've already claimed space for it. And the same with committees. Committees will often, or at least subcommittees will often go through the process of marking up and reporting a bill so that it's ready to be used when an omnibus comes along. And for this, with every appropriations omnibus, this is the case. You'll see the House appropriations subcommittees write their bills, even though they know that it's not going to be done that way. And like, they're not going to pass the 11 or 12 bills, and that's how they're going to fund the government. But they want to establish, like, we've already worked out this bill, this should work as the starting point for the omnibus negotiations. And so you don't see those actual, with your measures, you would see those bills would look like they were just left on the floor, but if you looked at the omnibus, you would see that a lot of that language was used. And so to a degree, that legislative effort still had an impact on what policy was made, but that specific individual bill wasn't used. And there's a lot of that going on now with, as Scott was saying, with these big packages and these appropriations bills being how the government is being run, being legislated on.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm gonna repeat myself here, but I mean, yeah, I think you're right that does characterize some of what's happening, at least. I mean, I know, you know, and some members and some committees, I mean, do in fact sort of operate that way. I know Rob Andrews from New Jersey a long time ago said that, you know, he really made an effort to write bills that could then get packaged in some bigger bill, because then they had a better chance of passing as part of a huge thing, rather than, you know, trying to find space for that smaller bill individually. And so, yeah, to a certain extent, that is sort of a goal for members and for committees, and I think too, and Scott and John Wilkinson's work on reauthorizations and others' work on reauthorizations have shown that, or shown and certainly suggest that, right, committees have an incentive to do that, to take whatever else they might be working on, and even if it wasn't necessarily a reauthorization, to at least wait and bundle them all together in that kind of package, at least that kind of omnibus package. A small business committee I can think of off the top of my head as one that at least has consciously done that in the past. So yes, that does characterize at least some of what's going on, I think. I have some measures where I try to speak to that, but not great ones, and that is something that I'm trying to account for now, and hopefully in the future I can do a better job of it.
Jason?
Well, we're on empirics now. I don't know any other way to say this. Table 1 is just a bit of a hodgepodge there. I lost count, actually, trying to count how many covariates you had and modeled an N of 300. I mean, is all of that necessary? I mean, I count four different indicator variables for partisan alignment. You know, you've got the 104th Congress, the Democratic majority, divided chambers, divided government. Can you be more concise about what you're trying to test and prune that down to maybe a single-digit number of covariates?
Yeah, I could. And admittedly, I mean, yeah, it doesn't look great, and I'm not happy with it either. I mean, one reason that I included so many was to try to sort of get around having to include fixed effects for time and for committees, for you know, all committees and for every Congress in the series. I'm fine using them. I fixed effects. My one beef with them is they don't really tell you anything substantive about sort of why they could be significant or not significant. So I was trying to get at some of those substantive effects might have been with more substantive variables like controlling for different factors in a committee's partisan alignment or the Congress's partisan alignment, things like that. But yeah, you're right. It's definitely not very concise, and I need to do a better job of conveying within the table. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And maybe just footnote that you fit this kitchen sink model, and a bunch of the stuff has no effect on the key things you're interested in, and go from there and make it much more concise.
Okay.
While we're on that topic, Scott had a good point about the scale on the figures. I think the patterns are quite interesting. I think it might make sense to combine those all together and just show us the overall trend in terms of hearings. And it looks like it's going to be downward sloping if I can sum all that together in my head properly. I think that might make the point, at least in some ways, more interesting than this splitting things up by committee, especially since you have some committees that go away over time. That could be affecting other committees because they're picking up jurisdictions. It should be easy for you to do. I just like to see those overall trends in there. I think you can use that as a way to motivate what you're doing. Why are these? Here's this empirical regularity. We've got this decline in hearings across time. Why is this happening?
So let me also ask a question, I think, of Jonathan to help me understand the connection between the theory and the measure. So I guess when I was reading the paper, I thought of it as like the committee making a choice where they could either handle policymaking internally to the committee or handle policymaking out external to the committee, right? And one theoretical point that I guess I passed over a bit was there was no discussion of which one was preferable, or given what the goal was, which one we would rather do, or what the conditions are under which we would prefer to simply have oversight hearings as opposed to pass legislation. But ignoring that for a second, the dependent variable, and this gets a bit to the Scott's point about counts, right? The dependent variable is not whether you handle it internally or externally; it's just how many times you handle it externally. And seems to me, right, in fact, it's sort of a trichotomous, really it's a trichotomous measure, right? I have a latent policy area that I wish to make policy in, or there is a latent policy area, right? I either don't do anything, presumably because I don't care very much, or it's not worth it to me. I try to handle the policymaking internally, right? So I have oversight hearings with no hope of passing legislation out of committee, or I pursue a strategy where I go up the chain, right? I try to report the bill, it gets onto the floor agenda, it gets considered, right? So there's a real, if that's your, one question is that really what you have in mind? Which I sort of at different times thought you did, and sometimes thought you didn't. But if it is what you had in mind, then it seems like there's a problem with the construction of your variables simply from a sort of transition from concept to measure, because it doesn't allow for the possibility that I choose the route of internal policymaking or hearings, oversight hearings, and that the real sort of version is that I don't do anything at all. So I guess you have a sort of, I'm curious to hear your take on that, or what you have in mind.
So the good news for me is that what I had in mind was what you were thinking as you're reading, is that it is about this choice that committees have between, oversight and non-legislative policymaking, which could be handled internally, or working on legislation to the floor, which then, of course, makes it more public and more external. Right. So that's the good news. That is, you're absolutely right. As you all point out, that my dependent variable doesn't really get at that choice. It's, as you note, it's just a count of, okay, well, how many times do they work on legislation, essentially? And that is something that I've thought of. I picked counts. So I started out with proportions, and I moved to counts more for ease of presentation and interpretability, but I can see that the that was the wrong choice to make, and so I'm going to move back to proportions because, again, as you say, that is closer to the theory that I'm interested in, or the phenomenon that I'm interested in.
Scott?
Yeah, so, I mean, I guess I would go back to where we started an hour ago. You know, motivate it with committees are behaving differently than they used to, right? Now, the first question is, are they simply, you know, as there's this presumption that committees are less critical, less central to the activities of Congress, are they simply doing less overall, right? And so you could show this by the various ways we've already talked about, you know, number of bills, amount of days active, those kinds of things. But you know, then I think it was Jason that said this, that you know, it's just reported as one dependent variable, which is sort of the where are you on the proportion of your activities that are legislating versus oversight, right? With the presumption that they are truly different, they have different goals. Now, you know, for some it may be that their overall activity has diminished significantly, such that even the mix of legislating versus oversight is less meaningful because they're just inactive, right? It's a committee that's just not active anymore. Versus ones where it's about the same amount of time that they're spending as meeting in committee, but the mix has changed quite considerably, and then that, you know, that now you're trying to explain that, and I agree with Jason said you got to simplify this table by a lot. There's a lot going on, and some of these are probably not that critical to understanding the bigger story, where we started today. And you know, there's a bunch of things you could throw out. You have hearings in here, right? Is it hearings predicting hearings?
Well, so that was an attempt to, since I wasn't using proportion, it was a way to control for sort of the total number of hearings that he was holding to
yeah, all right.
To get at this question of, okay, if committees are holding more referral hearings, is that just for more hearings overall?
Okay.
But I'm going to kill that and go back to proportion.
Jim, did you have something?
Oh, no. No.
I guess if I could just speak to a point that was brought up about, and this goes to presentation and empirics, but getting at this sort of overall trend, committee legislative activity or mix of committee legislative and oversight activity. I have looked at those. I don't know why I didn't put them in the paper because I have them. Right. So the committee hearing activity overall has declined in both chambers. But then, in addition to that, legislative hearings are taking up a much lower proportion of those hearings than they used to. Then, if you look at legislation in the House, the trend stays not quite level, but level enough that you can't really say with any definition or any definitive. You can't say definitively that it's gone down. In the Senate, it's clearly gone down. Legislative activity has clearly gone down chamber-wide in the Senate. The House, it's less clear, but I think the reason for that is when you look at the breakdowns by committee, there's one, maybe two committees that are pulling all the weight now. You know, the government affairs, I think banking became really active towards the end of this period, and so I agree. You know, the overall trends do need to help motivate this, and they're interesting in their own right. And then digging into those and looking at them at the committee level, I think then helps show not just that these trends we're observing these trends, not just that committee activity is changing, but where it's changing too, and that it's changing differently for different committees. Right, so the theme of this seems to be I need to do a much better job of that, and I recognize that, and I mean, but I can only thank you all again for your comments on these fronts, because they're going to be really helpful for me, and they're sparking a lot of ideas of how I can present these in a better way going forward.
Jim?
I think ideally you need some measure of how salient or something like that the issues under each committee's jurisdiction are at each point in time, because like you were just saying, there's some committees in the Senate that are doing all the work, and that's like the Finance Committee, because the issues under the Finance Committee's jurisdiction for the last several Congresses have been quite salient. These are the issues that have been in the public discourse, and so you're going to see those committees being way more active, probably doing a lot more legislating, less oversight. I think you need something like that to kind of get at what is in sort of a Sarah Binder type of way, like what is the need, how much need is there for legislating from this committee and this Congress, and then over time or in general, are committees doing less of that even though there's need, or is need still a major driver? And then once you take care of that sort of almost denominator type situation, then can you still see these patterns of committees reacting to sort of anticipated space that they're going to be given on the floor, should they act or not? But I think that, I don't know what a good measure for that is, but I think that's something that you want to investigate.
Jason?
I'm good right now.
Okay. Let me offer a suggestion that's probably not super useful for this particular paper, but in maybe the broader project, it'll be more useful. So, I mean, one of the ways that you can sort of narrow down what you really need in that table is to totally reorient the way you're thinking about, what those variables are for, right? I mean, fundamentally, right, these control variables are intended to try to sort of solve the problem that whatever you think your sort of treatment is non-randomly assigned, right? And so you've got every control variable you can think of because you don't know what the potential omitted variable is. But one way to sort of narrow that down a little bit
It just froze up for me.
Yeah, so people are going in and out here, so let me give it a second. We got everybody but Scott.
My screen froze minutes ago. I didn't know if that happened to anyone else.
Yeah, everybody fell out. I don't know, or at least for us, for me, everybody fell out, and we lost Scott. Okay. Scott's gone altogether here. Okay. Well, so anyway, I just to finish my point really quickly, I just think for future opportunities to sort of flesh this out, where you may try to just identify some more specific instances that you can look for constrictions of the agenda space, either for a particular committee or set of committees or for the entire set, because there are some implications of the theoretical setup you have that you can test in a much cleaner way, right, that don't have some of these measurement problems. All right, so we have about 5 minutes left, so we'll open it. Anybody that had comments they didn't get to sort of fit in, or anything they want to add for John before we part.
Is it okay?
Go ahead,
I just want to respond to Jim's point from a few minutes ago about issue salience for committee bills. I mean, yeah, that absolutely would be ideal. One way that I've thought about getting at this is, I'm sorry, they're starting to do yard work outside. I hope you all can't hear that. But one way I've thought about getting at that is these bills that are reserved for the speaker or the majority leader in each chamber. And now they're actually also reserved for the minority parties as well. Since this is part of my dissertation, I was going to spend some time in a different chapter looking at whether committees hold more hearings on the issues that those bills would address. And what I hadn't thought of, but I think as you rightly, several of you have rightly pointed out over the course of this conversation, is that relationship is going to be different for different committees, that some committees could be affected by that more than others for various reasons. But that is something that I thought about, and I don't know if that is the best way to get at it, but I think it's at least a pretty good first cut. The issue there is that I don't think they really started formally designating those bills until the 106th Congress. I've emailed back and forth with people at the kind of history office and the House Clerk's office and folks, and they know it's gone on for a while, but the earliest that they can recall anyone sort of explicitly doing it is the 106th Congress. And of course, then the problem in the Senate is, since it's so informal, is that sometimes they only reserve 5 bills, sometimes they reserve 20 bills. But that is a way that I'm planning on getting at this issue of, what you pointed out, that, yeah, there's a reason that the Banking Committee is putting out more legislation, is because their issues were more in demand. And so I'm going to try to get at more of that question of demand for a committee's legislation, or just for a particular issue in general.
Any other final thoughts, guys, before we sign off? Last chance, Scott.
Sorry, I got disconnected there for a minute.
We all did. It may have been me. I don't know.
Oh.
Jim?
I think that's roughly a good measure, because that will give you an indication of at least what's important to the parties.
Can I interrupt? I just what measure were we talking about here?
Sorry, this was bills that are reserved for the Speaker in the House or the Senate Majority Leader. This is HR 1 through 10 or S 1 through 10, roughly, that they can slot in bills for that they give priority to. So can I interject a little bit there? And this was to capture sort of the majority party agenda? Yeah, this sort of, the way Jim put it was sort of issue salience or demand for a particular issue on the floor.
Okay, so we, if you don't, I'm sorry, Jim, I'm stepping on your toes here, taking up some of your time. So in my book with Wilkerson, we have a bunch of different measures in there of sort of salience of issues captured on different dimensions, right? So we look at elite agendas. We use, as I think somebody mentioned already, Sarah Binder's data on New York Times editorials. We look at most important problem and sort of plug that in by, can't remember if it's major topic or subtopic level. We also tried to come up with a majority party agenda issue, and we used 2 things. One was what you mentioned, the first 10 bills, which is rather inconsistent. You'll find some congressional terms in which the first 10 bills seem to really be majority agenda items that were maybe not introduced by the Speaker, but introduced on behalf of the Speaker by some other lawmaker. But in this, I've been doing some recent work with another measure that we used in there, which I think is actually a little bit better, which is the speech of the Speaker on the first day of the term. Mm-hmm. And we've gone back to Tip O'Neill, and I want to say 1974 79. I can't remember which is the first year we did. They're obviously the agenda evolves a little bit over time, over the course of the congressional term. So, and you're not really capturing any of that. But actually, some of the speeches are okay. They're not bad. There are a few years in the middle there. I think Jim Wright doesn't even give a speech one time, or gives a really short speech. But every speaker since, from Gingrich on, those speeches have gotten longer and more policy content in them. In fact, Hastert, Pelosi, and Boehner, they've been quite long and filled with policy content. And I know this because we were just looking at them in the last week or two. And just to cite one other person who's looked at these, Barbara Sinclair has a piece. I don't have it at my fingertips. It's on like committee agendas or something like that. And I want to say it was published in LSQ, in which she tries to come up with a congressional majority agenda, and she uses one or the other of these. I think it's the speaker speech she uses. She doesn't use both of those, but she also uses some things like the response to the President's State of the Union address and a couple of other things. So I'm just throwing that out there because we've done a bunch of this stuff, and I just wanted to give you some other ideas on ways to go with that. I don't claim to have invented any of them. So.
No, but that's great. Thanks a lot. I appreciate that.
Sorry, Jim.
Jim and then Jason, if you want to.
Sorry, what?
Jim?
I mean, Scott basically said a lot of what I was going to say. That which is perfect. That like that numbers one is the numbers measure is pretty good, but it's better in some years than others. There's like a good period between like 1995 and 2007 where it works really well, and before and after that it's kind of bad because they only used a couple of the bill slots. But I think the speeches one is probably even an even better measure, especially since Gingrich.
Okay. Any last words from anybody? All right. John? What's that?
Yes, it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, a lot of fun. Jonathan, any final words before we sign off?
Yeah, I just want to circle back to what I said at the very beginning, that it was a real great opportunity to participate in this. I think it's a great idea, and that one hiccup aside, I think it worked out really well, and I appreciate all of your comments and the time you took to read through the paper and provide such thoughtful feedback. So I'm glad to participate in this, both because I think it's a good idea and also because I know my work is going to be a lot better now, just after talking to y'all. So thank you.
Well, thanks to everybody for participating in the inaugural run of this, and I thought, all technical difficulties aside, I thought it was terrific, and we'll work to smooth some of those things out. But please, tell your friends and students to, to send their papers in when we get the next call, and to hopefully, look to participate if we invite them as workshop panelists. So, thanks a lot, guys. We'll be in touch. One more thing. I'm going to try to. I think Jason and I are planning to host a reception maybe next year at APSA for all the LSVW participants that over the year. So just keep an eye out for that email. Hopefully, come by and have a beer, get to meet, say hello in person to everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nate.
Thanks so much for it.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Thanks.